good? Good evening. If everyone could take their seats. Before we begin, we will acknowledge the land on which we meet. We acknowledge the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat and Wyandot nations. We recognize these peoples and their ancestors as peoples who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The city of Mississauga is home to many global Indigenous peoples. As a municipality, the city of Mississauga is actively working towards reconciliation by confronting our past and our present, providing space for Indigenous peoples within their territory to recognize and uphold their treaty rights and to support Indigenous peoples. We formally recognize the Anishinaabe origins of our name and continue to make Mississauga a safe space for all Indigenous people. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Living Arts Centre. Thank you so much for being here tonight for what I know will be an exciting and engaging conversation. My name is Sherry Lichterman, and I have the honor of being the city manager and CAO for the great city of Mississauga. Thank you. I'm not even the main event. Wait till you see. It's going to get better. I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by many members of our leadership team today, and also many councillors. So we have here, I think they're all hiding over here in the corner. We have Ward 1 Councillor Stephen Dasco, Ward 2 Councillor Alvin Tejo, Ward 3 Councillor Chris Fonseca, Ward 4 Councillor John Kovac, Ward 6 Councillor Hornick, Ward 7, Councillor Demerla, Ward 8, Councillor Mahoney, Ward 9, Councillor Reed, and Ward 11, Councillor Butt. Hopefully I have gotten you all covered. Thank you all for joining us here today. And of course, all of you. This is a great crowd. We got such a great response to this event. Thrilled to have you all here. So the format for tonight's event is pretty straightforward. In just a few minutes, we'll hear from our guest, Brent Toderian. This will be followed by a bit of a fireside chat without the fire, where I'll be talking to and asking Brent some of our questions and mostly your questions. We are using technology called Slido to collect your questions. So behind me on the screen, yes, are the instructions on how to use Slido. And if you want to use your device, you go to slido.com and enter the event code, which is listed 1969458. Easy. For those who are unable to submit a question using your own device and you want to submit one, please flag down one of our volunteers who will have iPads. They're waving them around. There's at least one over here. They'll be around. So we'll be happy to assist you if you're having any trouble using your own device to do that. The Wi-Fi in here is free and can be found under Wireless Mississauga. And you can start sending in questions using Slido anytime, right now or anytime this evening. I'm expecting that we'll have a lot of questions. I hope we'll have a lot of questions coming forward. And so if you don't have your question answered, please don't worry. We're collecting them all. We'll work to answer them all even beyond this event, and we'll post them online at mississauga.ca/strategic plan 2024. So the best part about Slido is we get to capture all of your questions regardless of the time limits. And we're also planning to conduct some polls throughout the evening using this Slido technology, so watch for those. And that data that we collect is anonymous. All of the data, your questions, everything is anonymous. And it'll just be used to help inform us, particularly in the drafting of our new strategic plan for the city. So you probably heard, because Brent's been bragging about it quite a bit, that this is the third venue that we booked for this event because we kept outgrowing every venue that we chose. So to us, it demonstrates the interest people really have in being engaged and talking about the future of our city, which is fantastic. So tonight's the start of an important conversation about the future of Mississauga. And it's hard to believe, but our city is 50 years old this year. So we've grown and changed so much in that time, but we have a long way to go as we embark on our next 50 years. Tonight's about looking forward to those next 50 years for Mississauga and beyond. It's about having a conversation about what we as residents want our city to look like today and tomorrow. And whether you've been here for a few weeks, a few years, or your entire life, or if you're looking to make Mississauga your home in the future, your voice matters, and your participation matters, and your presence here tonight matters. So the last time we refreshed the strategic plan was in 2009, so I think you'll agree a lot has changed since then. As part of this process, we are bringing in speakers like the one we'll be hearing from tonight, and we're trying to bring in people who will ask tough questions, challenge us to think differently, and maybe make us a little uncomfortable. Is that okay over there? So the status quo will not move us forward, but when we do move forward, we have to do that together, understanding our goal is to build a world-class city where people want to live and work and spend their time and money. Our guest tonight is someone who has helped cities around the world to grow and change. Brent Toderian is a national and international thought leader on better cities and a leading global innovator in city planning, transportation, urban design, and advanced city building. He advises cities, governments, nonprofits, and best practice developers across Canada and all around the world. He established Toderian Urban Works in 2012, following 6 years of significant achievement as the Chief City Planner for Vancouver, BC, and 6 years as a transformative planning leader and manager in Calgary. Blah, blah, blah. So he's good. He's good. He's a great guy. We're thrilled to be working with him. I'm excited he's here tonight. He's an advisor on our strategic plan refresh. And without further ado, please join me in giving a big Mississauga welcome to Brent Toderian. Brent. Take a seat. Yes, I'll get that up there.
I always forget to tell them please not read my bio. It's too long and it's boring. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you to all of you for coming on a very cold night. Sherry is the reason I'm here, not just tonight, but helping the city of Mississauga. So if you're happy about that, you should thank her, and if you're unhappy about that, you can blame her. But she is the one who called me, and our first conversation immediately told me that this is the kind of city leadership, including her senior leadership team, that I like working with. So I'm very much looking forward not only to tonight, but the whole process. This is my second trip here. I've been working with the city for about 6 months now. And to say it's inspiring and creative is an understatement. So I'm really impressed with the leadership that your City Hall has. And if you think I'm sucking up to my client, you don't know me very well. I don't say things like that unless they're deserved. I am known for constructive candor, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm really blunt, sometimes to a fault. My Aussie clients say, you tell it like it is, but you're not a wanker about it, which basically means I'm trying to be constructive because it isn't about my ego. When I was chief planner of Vancouver, I didn't like when outsiders came to town and kind of crapped all over my city. I actually had a nickname for it. It's the drive-by shitting, where they come to town, crap all over the place, and I'm the one who usually has to make the comments about what City Hall thinks about all of those commentary. It's not constructive, and it's usually about the ego of the person who's coming to town, or they have a book to sell. That's not me. But candor is necessary because we need to tell the truth about the real situations we're facing if we're ever going to make progress. And I'll start with one of my points of constructive candor. If some of you are out there thinking, oh God, this guy's from Vancouver, doesn't he know that Mississauga isn't Vancouver? I get that a lot. As my 8-year-old son would say, duh. Of course you're not Vancouver. This is Vancouver. You are not Vancouver. You're not any of the probably, 300 or 500 cities that I've worked for. I always do stress, I was only chief planner for 6 of my 32 years, so this isn't just about Vancouver. And in the 12 years I've been gone from Vancouver City Hall, I've worked for many of the most innovative cities in the world. Frankly, cities a lot better than Vancouver. And so we're going to be talking about what every city can learn from every other city if you don't let your ego get in the way. Another piece of constructive candor, I will tell you that at some point in my talk, most of you will probably be thinking what I call the 8 most unhelpful words in the English language. We could never do that in our city. It is amazing to me how much energy goes into excuses for why what I or other people are talking about just isn't possible here. But I say what I've found in working in almost every continent and in some of the best and worst cities in the world, the difference isn't any of the excuses, any of the conditions that are brought up. It's whether or not you let those excuses get in the way and whether you have leadership and will to actually do better things. Another example of my constructive candor, this is a tweet that was put out after it was announced that I was coming. This person has been hired by City Manager Sherry Lichterman, am I pronouncing that right, Sherry? I always get yours wrong. To consult for a car-free Mississauga. No, I haven't. There is no car-free Mississauga being discussed here. How much taxpayer monies have gone to it? Well, you can FOIP that. It's public knowledge. Car drivers, he recommends buying a cart or a shopping trolley to walk to the grocery store. Yes, I do that. But I don't if you're miles and miles and miles away from the grocery store. That's kind of the problem. I hope for a balanced approach and not a zero-car policy. Well, I get a lot of comments when it's public knowledge that I'm coming to town. These are some of the nicer ones, frankly. And what I'll say to you is, no, there's nothing here about being anti-car. But I am very anti-car dependency, very. And I am going to be, and have already been, challenging your city about providing more choice, more options, more freedom. There is no banning of the car in this conversation. The war on the car is a lazy narrative by ultra-right-wing politicians who want to scare you and make you mad, or media that wants to get clicks. There is nothing here that is anti-car. But everything I say is proven with a business case and pro-better city. That has been proven to allow cities to succeed better for everyone, including drivers. And I'll get back to that. This is the appropriate word to start any conversation about the state of cities these days. Crisis. I'm a city planner. I was trained to be patient. That's literally what my education was about. We make a plan and then we wait, patiently, hopefully, for the plan to be realized over time. Well, we don't have all the time in the world. Urgency and, yes, crisis are the important words in city building these days. And I talk about the 5 crises in current global city building. The climate crisis, which I hope to God I don't have to explain to you. The housing crisis, which I hope to God I don't have to explain to you. The inequality, racism, and classism, and exclusivity of neighborhoods or inclusivity of neighborhoods crisis that plays out in how we've been designing and zoning and planning cities since there's been planning. The public health crisis that's tied pre-pandemic, tied to how we've been designing preventable diseases, obesity, into our society by designing out physical activity through car dependency, etc. We've been in a public health crisis tied to the way we build cities, and particularly suburbs, for decades before the pandemic came along. An infrastructure cost crisis that plays out every single time your council or any other council is having a conversation about potentially double-digit tax increases because of the absolutely brutal per capita infrastructure costs associated with car-dependent suburbs. It is bankrupting, or at least handcuffing financially, cities all over North America. And we're not connecting the dots enough to that, but it is an infrastructure cost crisis, not an infrastructure crisis. We can build the infrastructure for growth. We're just building growth, have been at least in the suburbs, in the most expensive way in human history by far. I commented back a number of years ago, a number of the GTA's top public health officers, the top doctors, got together and did a press conference about how we needed more walkable communities, transit-supportive communities, as preventative, upfront health, public health. And that this would be the smartest thing we could do to improve our public health and reduce our public health care costs, which I don't need to tell you are substantial, if not crippling. And I joked that if the chief planners of the regions held a press conference, the media wouldn't have come. But at that time, at least, pre-pandemic, public health officers were pretty cool people who got a lot of respect. Now it's a little occasionally different. There's some folks who don't like them. But back then, the doctors were probably our best allies in having a public conversation about how we've been building our cities and our suburbs. And it's important to have those allies. I actually, at the time, was hired by the Health Foundation of Australia, who hired me with their discretionary money to bring a Canadian planner to come down and talk to 5 states and city regions in Australia about public health through better city planning and urban design. And they put out this document called Does Density Matter? It's still online, you can Google it, but I'll give away the ending. Yes, density matters substantially to our public health. So there's a connecting of the dots that needs to be done. If you're not motivated by that or climate change or the housing, maybe money motivates you. Canada is actually the world leader in doing cost of growth analysis that shows how much more it costs to build car-dependent suburbs than it does to build walkable, transit-friendly infill. And once you've done this kind of study, I say it's like a bell that you can't unring. HRM, Halifax Regional Municipality, had this on the front page of their newspaper. They just did a study to see if we just changed the ratio a bit of growth in their new plan from greenfield to infill, just by 10 or 20%, $3 billion of difference over the life of the plan. And that was done by Stantec, which is a pretty conservative, frankly, consulting firm. So I suspect the number is actually higher. So every city I know of is struggling to pay for more with less. So the way we've been building is probably the single most important issue a city can change in order to lower your taxes and to do more in terms of your services and quality of life provision with less of your public money. So even if you don't care about any of those things I talked about and you just want your taxes low, the business case for everything I say is rock solid. Here's one of the challenges. You're in Ontario, and in Ontario, planners think that your system is very good. I used to think that the planning system in Ontario was very good because I started my career in Ontario. And it took me leaving Ontario to realize that it's probably the worst planning system in Canada. I say, I work for Ontario cities. I've been advising the city of Kingston for about 5 years now. I've worked in Burlington and Guelph more recently. And city planning in Ontario is like swimming with your feet tied together. It's possible, it's just a hell of a lot harder than it should be. And that's when you're actually trying to do good, effective community building, good, effective city planning. And that's a problem. But it's also, as I often say, not an excuse. Because I am seeing Ontario cities, including Kingston, which is punching above their weight and doing remarkable things with very smart city planning. When I first started working for Kingston, they had on their own, this was a bit cheeky of me, my first presentation in Kingston, I took the bio from their Twitter account, and it said, "We're working to become Canada's most sustainable city." It's not just in their bio, it's also in their strategic plan. But I noted that they didn't give themselves a deadline, which makes it kind of easy. But they did say most sustainable city of any size, so they were competing against Vancouver and Toronto, etc. But my question to them was simple. What would it really take to be the most sustainable city in Canada? When I come to work for cities, I don't give my vision. I look at the vision that the city has already stated. I find it. Sometimes it's sitting in a drawer collecting dust. But I look for it and I find it, and then I say, did you mean it? What would it take to actually achieve it? And by the way, what you're doing isn't going to get you there. So when I started working for Guelph, their target was to cut emissions in half by 2030. That's only 8 years from when I started working for them. So my question was, what would it really take, to reach a 63% reduction in per capita emissions by 2030? The bad news is my conclusion was, looking at all of their goals and policies and rules, etc., that they would be lucky to get there by 2050, and they probably wouldn't get there at all, based on what they were actually doing. There was a fundamental disconnect between what they claimed their vision was and what they were actually doing to make it happen. If you think the technology is going to save us, because there isn't the kind of significant action from City Hall, bad news, the technology isn't going to save us. Driverless cars very well may end up, if it ever happens, and I've sat on many panels and stages with the actual developers of the technology, and I'm doubtful it'll happen even within my lifetime, based on what they say, not what I say. Even if it does succeed, if those are not a shared fleet, it will end up with more cars on the road driving even more. And electric cars are a positive benefit. I am not against electric cars. What I'm against is leaders saying all we need to do is convert the fleet of existing cars in our cities to electric and we're done. Mission accomplished. It's not enough. Even these studies that have already been done shows that only gets us about 1/3 of the climate reductions that we actually need to get to address climate change, to keep it below the temperature rise that we know we need. And that's just on the climate side of the issue. There are all sorts of reasons to reduce the number of cars that doesn't have to do with whether or not there's a tailpipe. So the technology is not going to save us. And bad news if you're an Elon Musk fan, but tunnels for Teslas isn't going to save us either. I took some heat by saying that idea when he announced it was dumb and dangerous, so Elon he blocked me on Twitter. And then he unblocked me. A few years later, I actually had some conversations with his chief of staff about using that technology for transit instead of cars. So he unblocked me, and then he bought Twitter and started screwing it up, so I blocked him. These solutions are distractions. The reason they are a problem is I can't tell you how many times I've heard a mayor say to me, it's good news we don't have to invest in transit because this is the solution. They're not just a little distraction, they're a bad distraction. And some of it is purposeful. What I said to Wired magazine when they asked me to comment about Masdar, which is the gizmo green community in the United Arab Emirates. New technology can be advantageous, but it doesn't replace compact, walkable, complete communities and a good, very simple, basic relationship between housing and employment. The fundamentals. The fundamentals come from density, from use mix, and transportation infrastructure. 3 simple things that we know how to do better, we're just not. If you really want to talk about green, it's about how we think about every element of our city building. Every single aspect. It's not about a line in your strategy about green technology or green building or green cars. It's how we get all the fundamentals right. And I have friends who do great, remarkable constructs about green cities with every element, and I try to keep it simple in the context of conversations like this. If I want to know if your city hall is green, if your city planning is green, I look at how you're treating your density, how you're treating your trees, and how you're treating your cars. And I can tell everything I need to know about if you're green or not by how you treat those things. So let's talk about those things. I've been calling it for many years density done well. We need to achieve more density, but it's not just throwing it up. It's not doing it badly. There's a lot of shitty density out there. But there are fundamental, easy ways to do it well, and if you do it well, you get all these public benefits. I actually started using this slide when I first became chief planner of Vancouver. I went around neighborhood to neighborhood talking about why we needed to densify and why the public interest is supported by density, not developer profit, because the narrative was, well, if we're talking about density, you must be in the pockets of a developer, because that's just about developer profit. No, these are the public interest reasons why city halls need to be talking, frankly, much better than they do about density. And I've been using this same slide since then. That was 2006. I watch with great consternation. In some cases, I'm happy. I'm not sure how to feel about it. This growing divide. It's kind of like the right and the left in American politics. The divide between the so-called NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and the so-called YIMBYs, yes, in my backyard, increasingly polarizing. And everyone in the middle who doesn't understand, isn't sure where to fall on this range. I tend to talk about Quimby, and when I'm saying that, I'm not talking about Mayor Quimby on The Simpsons. I'm talking about quality in my backyard. We need a conversation that, yes, promotes density and housing, but does not jettison the conversation about quality. And that's, in its worst moments, what YIMBY does. And I don't blame them for that, because they often say that the conversation about quality is just a Trojan horse to say no to housing, because it's never good enough. And I get that. But sophisticated cities can have a conversation about quality without saying no. It's about how. So I talk about density done well at every scale and not having scale dogma, as I call it. I have no time for urbanists and architects who are so fixated on human scale, which is an important aspect in urban design, that, well, there's one famous architect who says there's a special level of hell dedicated to architects who design buildings over 6 floors. That kind of dogma is not helping the discourse about how we address our challenges as cities. So every scale done better. I have no fear of heights. I want cities to embrace heights in the right way, in the right places, be clear about where height is not allowed, be clear with your expectations about how to do it well, do your mid-rise really well. This is our Olympic Village, which we built in time for the 2010 Winter Games. This was in 2010 named the greenest community in North America. I'm embarrassed that 14 years later it still has the most LEED ND points ever bestowed. Of course, we've moved on a bit from LEED, but there should have been a lot more communities that have surpassed it by now, and still technically on paper the greenest. And that's a problem. And then how we densify our neighborhoods beyond the transit areas, beyond the transit corridors, in the neighborhoods. I don't need to tell you that there's been some awfully big moves recently, both at the provincial scale and in the context of the Housing Accelerator Fund, and cities like yours doing more to essentially get rid of that concept of single-family zoning. Because when I was talking about this in 2007 as chief planner of Vancouver, which was a long time ago, I made up terms like gentle, hidden, and invisible density to have a conversation with the communities about how you could add housing types and it would actually stabilize your neighborhood, not change it. There's no such thing as the concept of stable neighborhoods, despite what the City of Toronto plan has in its wording. Stable neighborhoods are a mythology. You cannot stop change. And when you're actually prohibiting housing types, it's the opposite of stabilization, because you have fewer people per household, the kids are moving out, and the houses aren't turning over. So your school is under threat of closure, your local school. And boy, the school boards would like to close those anyway, because they want regional scale schools that everybody has to drive to. Your local retailing, the things you can walk to theoretically in your neighborhood, are under threat of closure because there isn't enough population support. Does any of that sound stable to you? So you can actually have a conversation about adding housing types and actually stabilize your neighborhoods. And by the way, the aging parents who have the large house now may potentially have the opportunity to downsize in their neighborhood, which they want to do, but they don't want to leave their neighborhoods, so they stay in the big house. And maybe they could give their kids and the grandkids the original house so that they stay in the neighborhood and they don't have to drive out far to the suburbs to see your grandkids. I have heard so many conversations about how change in your neighborhood can be a good thing, which is very different than to just, no, change is bad. I don't want any different housing types in my neighborhood because I like my quality of life exactly the way it was when I moved in. So in Vancouver, we brought in laneway housing. This was my hidden density because it was tucked in behind. Invisible density were secondary suites, which we allowed as of right in 2004 in Vancouver. We brought in laneway housing on top of that in 2007. The type of housing that there is now angst in the community about in Mississauga, Vancouver has allowed for 15 or 16 years. And Vancouver's doing okay in terms of livability. It's very expensive, but the livability hasn't been in question. So you're now getting to a point where you're having the conversations about change in neighborhoods that other cities have been in for a long time. Vancouver, we have probably about 10,000 laneway houses actually approved. So this has been going on for a while. So I use the term gentle density. My friend Daniel Perolik in California came up with a better brand, the missing middle. You probably heard that, missing middle housing. I like that better, and it's frankly being used a lot, but both terms are good. Gentle suggests that it's relatively low impact, doesn't change really the nature and scale of the community. Missing middle emphasizes the fact that it's not there. We haven't been building it. So we have either single detached homes or high mid-rise. And we were missing a whole opportunity to provide housing choice in our neighborhoods. So tall buildings. Tall buildings aren't just a downtown thing. And there is a lot of dogma about tall buildings, a lot of fear, because there is what I call a fear of heights. A lot of objectors to tall buildings refer to what I often hear as vertical sprawl. Oh, it's a bad thing. It's like a cul-de-sac in the sky. And what I say is, that's bullshit. There is such a thing as vertical sprawl. That's when you build tall buildings out in the suburbs in a car-dependent place with no public transit, where you ride down the elevator, which is a form of public transit, I often say, and go into the parking garage and vomit out onto the expressway. It's car-dependent tall buildings. That is vertical sprawl. But some people use that term to reference any tall building, which is wrong. If you ride down the elevator like I do every day in downtown Vancouver, and walk my kids to school, walk to the grocery store, 3 within 2 blocks that I can choose from, walk to anything, or take public transit or ride my bike, that is vertical urbanism. There is nothing sprawl about that. So there is a difference. Are you, just because you're doing tall buildings, are you building vertical sprawl or vertical urbanism? Let's at least be accurate and precise. But there's too much dogma around what I call the Montparnasse effect. This is the Montparnasse Tower in Paris. It is the reason why no tall buildings were in central Paris. They built this. It casts shadow. Not only is it ugly, it casts shadow directly on Montparnasse Cemetery, which is one of the most beloved spaces in Paris. So I call it the middle finger to Parisians. It's the reason why Paris said no tall buildings for a long time. And if you allow tall buildings like this, council is going to say no more. The people are going to say no more. I often say if this is what I was going to get in Vancouver, I would have said no more. But you don't have to have it that way. When I was hired by Kingston, tall buildings were one of the most contentious issues. They asked me what I thought about addressing the height in these buildings. These were the tall buildings they were building in Kingston. And I said I can name 10 things that are awful about these buildings without even talking about height. And yet the public discourse was just, well, how many floors are they proposing? Oh, that's too many. So that's bad design. We are myopically fixated on height, when what we should be fixated on is quality of design and growth. I advised the city of Helsinki, Finland for a while. The picture in the bottom, right here, was a proposal for tall buildings. I don't know if this is working. The picture in the bottom, and they asked me to peer review it. We did a workshop, and I took them through all the things that were wrong with the proposal and didn't mention height, and said, you can turn this into it's, by the way, this is right on the second station for the rail, heavy rail, passenger rail. So a very urban place, second only to the central station right downtown. So they wanted density, they wanted urbanism, but they were deathly afraid of height, like many European cities started off as. So I gave them a whole bunch of advice which they didn't follow, and they ended up approving this building in the back. And they were happy because they managed to get the height down a bit. But it is the most packed. When you walk in there, you feel like you're like this. And they made it worse. When they could have made the tall towers associated with a street, having a street presence, having active uses at grade, all the things that would make tall buildings good design, like we do in Vancouver, for example. But instead, they made the density about as worse as they can get, all because they were absolutely fixated on how many floors were being proposed. So European cities get this bad too, or wrong too. But it might interest you to know that most of those European cities have been hiring me lately to help them with a different approach to tall buildings, such as Oslo, Norway, and I'll get to that in a minute. In Vancouver, I said I won't talk all about Vancouver, but I am going to reference it occasionally. In Vancouver, the attitude that long predated me was that height is just a design challenge. And if you do it well with tower separation and thin towers and podiums that create a human scale and stepping back of the towers so that the human scale is established by the podium. The height provides the body heat and density where you can ride down the elevator like a public transit system and activate your neighborhood with vibrancy that comes from people. This works. This is good urbanism. This is how you do tall buildings. And this is how those buildings land. They land with generous giving, generous granting of quality to the walker, rewarding the walker for doing something that's sustainable and healthy, essentially, by always providing a quality walking experience. Not just in the horizontal. You see wide sidewalks, double rows of trees, which is quite common in Vancouver. A clear differentiation of private, semi-private, and public space through an elevated change in grade. All the things that make at-grade housing units give life and eyes on the street to make a successful public realm. So careful design. You're doing more of this in downtown Mississauga, but you're not quite getting the change in grade right. But I've seen some pretty good examples of progress in this area in your new downtown housing that I've seen. But always active things are great. The #1 urban design principle in Vancouver urbanism, no blank walls. 3 words. No blank walls. And when you're activating the street, you're essentially rewarding people enough that they actually slow down and enjoy the street. When I talk to traffic engineers who are enlightened and realize that streets aren't about moving cars, they're about moving people, they still tend to think about moving pedestrians. And I say the definition of success is when you actually slow down pedestrians, what I call sticky streets, which isn't about gum on your shoe, it's about slowing down the pedestrians so they're actually enjoying the street, their neighbors, etc. One of my heroes, Jonathan Barnett, many of you who are city planners or urbanists would know him, said it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. He's actually wrong. It's both. It is how dense you make it. It matters how dense you make it. Density is just a technical word for homes in a housing crisis. We need more density, and we need to challenge our own comfort levels, including our urban design comfort levels, to achieve more housing and a lower carbon footprint per capita. So it matters how dense it is, but it definitely matters how dense you make it. And when it comes to height, this is what I say. It's not just how tall you make it, but how you make it tall. When I advised Oslo on their new tall building strategy, these were all the conditions we built into the approach. And I'm not going to stay on this slide for long, so if you want a picture of it, take it real quick. But the point is, only one of these is height. The rest of them are other things. If you want your tall towers in your urban places to have families, which is a specific policy consideration, because many downtowns have kind of given up on families. Many city halls have given up on them in their downtowns and urban places. But if you want households with kids in your downtown, Vancouver has 7,000 kids in our downtown peninsula, and coming on to 4 elementary schools. Then you need 3 things. You need family-sized housing, and you probably need to mandate it. That's 2- and 3-bedroom minimum units. You need some of them, 20, 30%. You need households that can actually fit families. You need kids-supporting amenities, daycare, schools, and supports. Or else you may be able to fit the families, but then what happens when they have to drive out of the downtown to go to their daycare or go to their schools? And you need to design the public realm for kids. In that order, housing is the deal breaker. It's game over if you don't build units with more than one. By the way, I hate the word units, so I shouldn't have said it out loud. These are homes. Never call them units. Call them apartments if you want. But they are homes. If you don't have family-sized homes, it's game over. But then you have to do the other things too. So I'm doing downtown housing strategies, including with Sacramento, California right now. This is what we're building, because we want more housing, not just for adults and double income, no kids, or seniors or singles, but families. Trees. I'm not a tree hugger. I don't talk about trees because I'm going to read a poem. I am extremely practical about trees. Trees are essential infrastructure for good city making. They are one of the smartest investments any city can make. The sheer number of public interests that trees support, over and above just whether you like them or not, is significant. The return on investment, the value creation is staggering. It is colossally stupid that we do such a bad job with trees in cities. And that's a pragmatic thing to say. I'm talking from the business case perspective. There are so many reasons to do it. So it's not just that I like to show pictures of streets with trees. This is the easy place to do trees because it's in the public realm along the paths. This is the seawall and other places in Vancouver. This is the streets, as I told you, the double row of trees. This is one of my favorites right in my neighborhood. There's actually 4 rows of trees on each side. One next to the curb, one in the yard, one in the upper yard, and there's actually trees on the unit tops. So the canopy that's created, the change in microclimate, this is my kids' favorite street. When they walk in, it immediately cools down. This is important in a warming climate for warming cities where there's such a thing now as the heat dome effect and people actually dying. But that's only about 1 of 20 reasons why trees are a good investment. So can we please stop talking about trees like it's something that tree huggers want? I'm not being dismissive to tree huggers. I'm making the point that that's how it's often characterized in City Hall, where trees get an eye roll frankly. They should be an incredibly pragmatic thing for cities to champion. This is even, by the way, courtyards are a very good thing for density and development. This is our courtyard in my building. This is the interior above grade on the top of the third floor, on top of the parking podium courtyard, which has this, again, kind of canopy. So that's trees. Let's talk about the last one, cars. I could do 45 minutes just on cars. And as I said, this is not an anti-car message, but there needs to be a fundamental change in the way we've surrendered our priorities, surrendered our physical space in cities to almost cars only. And it's not really just cars we're talking about anymore. We all tend to use cars as a short form for all the vehicles. Increasingly, what we're talking about is SUVs and trucks, pickup trucks. Bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's actually erased most of the benefits of the greening of the vehicle technology. Emissions are actually going up, not down, despite the improvements in green technology over time, because SUVs are so much heavier, trucks are even heavier than that. It's erasing the advantage. It's actually called Jevons paradox. When we think something is green, we end up using it more. We buy more vehicles and we drive them further because they're green. And our emissions actually end up going up. And that's before talking about things like the explosions in pedestrian deaths that have to do with not only vehicle speeds, but vehicle size, etc. When I'm talking about cars, I am going to talk about infrastructure for transportation, but I always start with this point. The best transportation plan is a great land use plan. If you actually do your density right, it gets you about 70% of the way there to solving your transportation problems. The infrastructure is the last 30%. But if you've got a good infrastructure that connects nothing with nothing in low-density sprawl, you're not going to get shift from cars to walking, biking, and transit. So never forget, the best transportation plan is a great land use plan. Also, you're not going to solve the problem through adding more lanes. I hope I don't need to explain this. Since 1955, when Lewis Mumford said this, we really should have understood it by now. Adding car lanes to deal with traffic congestion is like loosening your belt to cure obesity. We will never solve traffic congestion with more lanes. It's called induced demand or induced traffic. It just induces more driving and more sprawl and more car dependency. The only way you really address traffic congestion is by building other ways of getting around and combined with pricing mechanisms. Those are the only ways you will actually have fewer vehicles in your lanes. But the real goal is to move more people, but not with more cars. What we need are complete streets where we are balancing different modes. I don't even like the word balancing. Don't forget that word. What we're trying to do is move more people with fewer cars, more people in the same or even less space. And an example of that are my clients in Oslo. They buried the highway that was disconnecting the downtown with the fjord to build their fjord city concept. Best waterfront transformation of any city in the world. If you haven't been to Oslo, you should go. But the interesting thing about this is underneath what I'm showing you now is the now buried freeway. They still move a lot of cars there, but they actually move more people in the multimodal boulevard than they did before on the freeway in cars. They move more people in cars and buses, bus-only lanes, tram, and bike lanes. They move more people each day on this. And it took a fraction of the space. The rest of the space, they built office space, housing, a community center, a certain portion of the Oslo Opera House, if you know that iconic building, all because they buried the freeway. So not only did they build this great community, they're actually moving more people. As soon as you realize that the job of transportation in cities is not to move cars, but to move people, then you know that we can move more people with less space, with less public cost, with better public health. Any way you measure success rationally in a city, you can move more as soon as you remember that the job isn't to just move cars. It's to move people. So our goal as cities grow in people, we need fewer cars. More people, less cars, fewer cars. Less driving, more choices, better communities, and stronger cities. That is the math of more successful cities. We need to prioritize, reprioritize the way we've been organizing our space, our budgets, etc. Not cars first, second, and third, and then everything else. But walking, biking, transit, goods movement, and then the private car. We don't ban the car. We just prioritize it last. City after city is putting this into their policies now. I've helped a number of cities do it. This is Medellin, Colombia, where we put it into both the transportation plan and the new land use plan. Budget is particularly important because you can claim to reprioritize space, but often the truth is where you're putting your money. I often say the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision statement, it's found in its budget. So when we're talking about bikes, this is not a cars versus bikes battle, but if you want more bikes, bike riding, more trips by bike, the only answer, the only way we'll achieve that is separated, protected bike share. Full stop, period. Paint is not infrastructure. Painted bike lanes do not make, studies have shown, do not make bike riding safer. And share roads actually make bike riding more dangerous. If you want people, rational people who aren't the hard chargers who will go in fundamentally unsafe conditions, if you want any other rational people to want to take the bike as a mode of transportation, not as a mode of recreation, separated, protected bike network, a minimum grid, and you build it fast. Not one bike lane at a time, pulling the Band-Aid off slowly, probably forcing yourself into a scenario of bad politics every year. Why aren't there more people using the bike lane we just built? Well, because you have one bike lane. You don't have a minimum grid. You don't have a connected system. You're never going to get more mode share until you've built enough and built it well, and then maintain it well when it snows, etc., in the winter. So if you want this, then do it right. This is Vancouver's approach, all ages and abilities, AAA. It starts with basic separation and protection, but it's more than just that. It's width, it's orientation, etc. If you want people to switch, do it right. And if you think, well, that's Vancouver, this is Calgary, where I planned before Vancouver. This is the best bike pilot that's been done in North America. A minimum grid, protected bike system in downtown Calgary. They barely got it passed as a pilot, and by the time the pilot was finished, in Calgary, they got a unanimous vote by council to make it perfect, because they showed that it wasn't Carmageddon, and people actually used it when you provided a minimum grid. And this is Calgary, for God's sakes. If Calgary can do it, why can't you? And when Edmonton copied Calgary, because the Battle of Alberta isn't just about hockey, when they copied, because they didn't like all the attention that Calgary was getting, they said, we won't even do a pilot, we'll just do it, which was good for them. Calgary and Edmonton have both done it now. Why can't you? This isn't about cars versus bikes. As I've said, that's just a narrative to get clicks and angry voters. This is about how we have been prioritizing our space. Because this is the truth. We've surrendered so much space to not even the driver. The driver doesn't take up much space at all. It's the car that takes up space. And somebody redid the image to show this during the pandemic. It was even worse. You've seen image after image. I collect these of the difference in space. This is my clients in Santiago, Chile. I like this one the best because they showed a bus in the middle. So not only does it make the point about how much space cars take, it shows how fundamentally inequitable it is for public transit. That bus is stuck in the same car congestion as everyone else, but look at all the people in the bus. That is the argument for bus-only lanes. If you want mode shift to public transit, bus-only lanes are probably the simplest, quickest, most effective thing you could do. I'll take out the word probably. It is. My clients in Sydney, Australia put out this language. How do you move 1,000 people into your downtown? 1 train, 15 buses, or up to 1,000 cars using 1.37 hectares of land for parking, or space for parking. This is about space. It's geometry. If everyone's driving, no one's moving. If everyone's driving, no one's moving. So if you're thinking to yourself, but I don't want to take my bike, I don't want to take public transit, I don't want to walk, fine, then drive. But the best thing you can hope for is the person sitting beside you is walking, the person on the other side is taking transit, and the person behind you is taking their bike. Because if not, they're stuck in traffic in front of you. That's geometry. There is no war in the car. There's just smart or dumb cities. Parking is connected to this. This is my work in Kingston on parking specifically. We had the most aggressive and candid conversation about what I call the power of parking in Kingston and the real parking problem, which is not that there was too much parking, or not enough parking, but there was actually too much. And we took it to the public in only 2 months. We did it quick and changed the conversation about the P word, which usually stands in the way of almost any progress on density and everything else we do in city making. It is remarkable. We sort of explain to the community about everything you care about, whether it's affordable housing or climate change or heritage preservation, is being killed by how you're doing parking regulations. So that's not necessarily advice to get rid of your parking minimums, although many cities are doing that, then that can be a very good thing. But in Kingston, we didn't get rid of the parking minimums. We just created a system where you could get lower parking in return for things that the city wasn't able to regulate, like car share spaces and extra large places for bikes and more common bikes, like cargo bikes, etc., and electric bikes and electric vehicles. So we use an incentive basis to get the parking down while out paying for other things. So you can do either. But the key is to stop being the problem if you're City Hall, because many city halls are actually mandating excessive parking. It's not the developer. Sometimes it is the developer over providing parking too, but often it's your own City Hall rules that are leading to too much parking. So when we did Kingston, it got a lot of attention, including the United States, and my favorite title was Steal This Idea. Because although there's a big conversation about just getting rid of parking minimums, I think there should be an equal conversation about an approach like we did in Kingston, which didn't get rid of them, but used parking strategically to achieve other things as well. And by the way, parking minimums are important, but just as important, particularly in the downtown, are parking maximums. And that should be a conversation too. Here's the point, if I have to leave on this. If you design a city primarily for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers. If you design a multimodal city, it works better for everyone, including drivers. If you're sitting there in the audience thinking, I'm a driver, what about me? This works better for you. And I'm not making that up. It's a fact. If everyone's driving, no one's moving. So the next time you're looking at that bike lane and you're thinking, that bike lane is the reason I'm stuck in traffic, it's not. And the next time you're thinking, why aren't there more bikes in that bike lane? It's because it's one bike lane. And there's no minimum grid. Think about trying to drive around the city if there was only one street. Would you take your car out? You need something that you don't have yet. You haven't seen what urban biking can do in your city because you've never even tried to facilitate really urban biking. I'm going to move a little faster because I've only got a few more minutes. The big problem is how you do your suburbs, and somebody's thinking, well, that's an unfair picture. Our suburbs are much nicer than that. They probably are, but that's not the point. Yours are car dependent. So is this. Not all suburbia is sprawl. Not all of it is. I don't say everything in the suburbs is sprawl, but too much of it is, and the key problem with sprawl is auto dependency, car dependency. If you're building car dependency, you're building sprawl, because you're building houses and cars, and that's all that's pretty much out there. I'm overstating a bit for effect, but that is the basic truth. The success or failure of our cities, and ultimately our survival relative to climate change, etc., depends on how well we do our suburbs, because that's where most people live in Canada, and still where most people are going. We can do great things with housing in the downtown, but it is how well we can improve the existing suburbs and do better suburbs in the future, because we're not talking about stopping suburbs, but we need a fundamentally different suburb, and that's related to car dependency. And let's be candid. When I talk anywhere about Mississauga, this is what I hear, and this is what I know from my own 32 years, including the 10 years of my career where I started in Ontario. Mississauga's been known for a slightly better class of sprawl. You're still building sprawl, but it's nicer. And decades-long attempt to build a real downtown. It's good that you're trying to build a downtown. What I often say to cities is, are you trying to build a real urban place or just a really higher density suburb? You can have tall buildings and it can still be suburban. Your downtown still is suburban. And the reason I say that, I didn't make up this slide for this presentation. I've been using this slide for years. Can we fix the problem of scale, mix, and place? I'm working in many cities where they are trying to create or have been creating new downtowns in a former suburb. And the problem is scale, mix, and place. The scale, and I use Mississauga as the example, the scale is still scale to the car. Every time I've come, I still walk around the downtown, including today. It's scale to the car. You have sidewalks, but everything feels so damn far away because it's scaled to driving. So everything is just further and seems further than it needs to be, especially on a cold day like today. The mix of uses that a downtown has, well, you have housing, it's over there. You have office, it's over there. Your retailing is back there. None of it is integrated. So you have the checklist mix, but you don't have the real urban mix that a real downtown has. And place, as is often said, there's no there there. There are some improvements. I've seen some interesting things done at the edge of Square One, some placemaking, which I actually think are pretty good. But by and large, there's no there there. There's no placemaking, there's no sense of place that makes downtowns special and thus able to compete with the suburban mall because there's a reason to come there. Every suburb trying to create a downtown is struggling with these three issues. And you are the poster child for illustrating those three. And these three are the key to your downtown getting better. For a long time, I talked about what I call the 5 steps of better cities. I created it as a construct to start a conversation with my urban clients about where they are relative to a particular issue. And the whole city isn't in one place. You see at the bottom, where's your city today, issue by issue. So step 1 is you start off doing the wrong thing. There's a lot of cities still doing the wrong thing. Then you move on to doing the wrong thing better. Electric cars is doing the wrong thing better. Your suburbs are doing the wrong thing better. It's still the wrong thing, but you're doing it better. And I always say if you're going to do the wrong thing, you might as well do it better. I give credit for that, but never mistake that for doing the right thing. So you move on to, I added this one in after working in a city where literally they were paying to build the LRT and right beside the LRT, widen the highway at the same time, having your cake and eat it too. And they wondered why there wasn't mode shift from car driving to transit. Well, you're making it easier to drive at the same time as providing an option or an alternative. Then you move on to doing the right thing badly. That's your downtown. You're doing the right thing, it's just not particularly well done. And that's not to say it isn't commendable to have all that new housing, and much of that new housing is done much better than you have in the past. It's quite credible. But you eventually get to doing the right thing well. So on almost any issue, I run it through this kind of a system, and then I wrote an article about it in Fast Company, which I write for to sort of explain it so that cities can use this as a conversation starter on pick any issue and ask yourself the question, where is Mississauga in that 5-step list? If you want to remember it, just find this article. I'm going to talk briefly about, sorry, I know I'm going long. I'm going to talk briefly about what we do in the meantime, because you have good plans for how the city will build out and change. My observation is you don't have deadlines. You don't have a clear sense of when something is going to happen, and a real strategy around, frankly, how to make it happen faster. So you're being patient in the context of a crisis. You're being too patient. So I talk about the immediate city. I used to call it the temporary city, but that somehow seems like a pejorative. Temporary feels like you're not doing a good job. The immediate city is you do it fast. There's a lot of really simple, fast things that could be done really quickly to strengthen our city, but we make those simple things hard with our attitude, with our culture. Latin American cities, boy, are they good at this. I do a lot of work in Latin America. They transform spaces almost overnight, sometimes overnight. Parking lots, etc. These are my clients in Auckland, New Zealand. When they were trying to position the waterfront for redevelopment, they did this kind of transformation of the parking lot edges to get people to be able to walk better, enjoy the walk more. A lot of cities are doing a lot with container urbanism. And it doesn't matter if it's containers or modular or what have you. The point is, you can do it quick. The top image is Christchurch, New Zealand, where I worked. They lost 60% of their building stock in the downtown to the earthquake. And they built a tremendously high-quality temporary city. And frankly, I use them as the best model for how to fill in the gaps and the holes in a downtown that isn't quite there yet. And boy, do you have a lot of gaps and holes in your downtown. And you should be coming up with a strategy really quickly. I actually think you should hold an idea competition about how to enliven the downtown as it is today while we're waiting for the rest of the physical permanent transformation to happen. And permanent is a funny word because downtowns are never done. But I'm talking about at least getting the next evolution of building done. You need to be doing something in the meantime. We've waited long enough for that downtown to be vibrant. It's got too many gaps, too many holes. This is one of the worst corners in downtown Brisbane, which became the best corner in downtown Brisbane by sheer number of people who congregate at it. Great burgers. And a very simple way to activate a dead space. Food trucks are another way of doing this. Parklets are another way of doing this. There's all sorts of ways you can add vitality and life in dead places. And you've got far too many dead places in your downtown for it to be functioning as a vibrant downtown yet. The pandemic gave us a lot of opportunities to do things differently, and we did many things differently for a little while. And then as our leaders said, well, the pandemic's over, let's go back to doing it badly. That was a colossal failure of leadership, of vision. We learned a lot, and then we promptly forgot it. I got to tell you, my global and European clients did not do that. They learned from the pandemic, and the good ideas were made permanent. It's one of the reasons why their city building is better than ours. My clients in Ireland, I work for the Irish Redevelopment Agency. Dublin was often referred to in Ireland as the city where good ideas go to die. And one of the things that was said during the pandemic was things that seemed unimaginable and unobtainable until very recently are suddenly just happening on Dublin streets. That's the power of the situation. I don't call it the opportunity of the pandemic because a lot of people died. My father died of COVID. I call it the responsibility of the pandemic to learn and do better. Other cities did, we didn't. So, I'll end with some snappers. What is good city building in a 5-crisis world? I don't want you to forget those 5 crises. You should be able to connect every single decision City Hall makes to how is it supporting or not supporting those 5 crises. The good ideas are the easy part. The real challenge is being honest about why they haven't happened yet and actually changing that. Is it culture? Is it leadership? Is it excuse? Is it regulation? Probably not. It's probably excuse. And as Sherry said, one of the things we're working on right now is the new strategic plan. Early days. That's why you haven't heard much about it. But already what we're talking about is a fundamentally different kind of strategic plan. I will give away a secret. I don't like strategic plans. I think they sit on shelves collecting dust in city halls, and most of them have had zero change as a result of them. And you could literally substitute one city's name for another because they are cut and paste exercises at city halls. Can you tell how I feel about them? So my comments to your leaders who are right on board, if we're going to do a strategic plan, we should do a good one and a fundamentally different one. And the key words we're using, turning point. Those are the 2 most important words in the conversation. What would it take to create a true turning point for Mississauga? What does a turning point even mean? I can't answer that. You need to answer that. It's your city. What's a turning point look like for density? What's a turning point look like for housing? What's a turning point look like for transportation? What's a turning point look like for urban biking? I know that's been contentious recently, but it's got to be part of your strategy. It's what smart cities are doing. What's the turning point look like for your downtown? Not when it's finished, but right now, today. What's a turning point for how we talk about city building? It's great that you've asked me to come and do this conversation. In cities where I work that are really doing great things, this kind of conversation can happen almost every night of the week. The conversation is constant and ubiquitous. It's everywhere because it's just a conversation that is separate from an engagement on a particular plan or a project. It's just a constant conversation about how to build a better city. And I often say, for me, it's what differentiates the cities that are doing well and the cities that are not. You can go to some cities where this conversation never happens. And in Vancouver, I often said when I first arrived there, you couldn't swing a stick on a given weeknight without hitting one of these conversations. It just happens all the time. So what do you really want for your city? I was asked, what's my vision for Mississauga in 50 years? It's not about my vision. But I'll ask you what yours is, and then I'll tell you the truth about what it would really take to achieve it. Are you willing to do what's necessary to actually achieve it? Or do you say you want it, but as soon as the hard conversation comes on, you say, I didn't mean that. I don't want that. Mississauga needs a new vision, less patience, a lot more will and skill, including political will, fewer excuses, and faster action. So what do you say Mississauga will look like in 50 years? Thank you very much. So Sherry's going to come out, and we're going to have a conversation. She's going to scowl at me for taking too long. That's my fault.
No, all good.
But I appreciate your attention.
I can listen to you talk for hours. How about you guys? How was that? That was great. We have piles of questions coming in. So I don't want to monopolize the question asking. I want all of the folks here to be able to get as many questions in as possible. But I think I would like to ask, we've been through lots of interesting debates at council, at planning committee, for years, but in the past couple of years. And you've been in that position. You've been the chief planner. You've been sitting in front of council, listening to residents coming forward on development and policy changes. What do you say to the residents, and the representatives, the councillors who represent them, the residents who feel like, hey, I moved here for a certain experience, quality of life, situation, and, that's what I want out of this. So why are you trying to change it? What do you say to that? Because, there are legitimately people who've been living here for years and years and years, particularly in certain neighborhoods. A lot of this change is big change. It really affects, their life or the lifestyle they've become accustomed to. So, how do we help answer that question? Because it's a legitimate question.
Sure. And the nice thing about the community building conversation is everybody's opinions are valid, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be happy with the decision and the results. One thing I've often said is I haven't seen a single city that has managed to not change. The inherent nature of cities is that they are always changing, whether we plan it or not, whether we like it or not. The conversation I talked about stable neighborhoods is on point. Some people would say, I don't want new housing types in my neighborhood because I don't want my neighborhood to change. Well, as we pointed out, your neighborhood is changing. Its population has dropped. You've got fewer people per household, fewer people in the neighborhood. Your school is under threat of closing. When I was having this conversation in Vancouver, it was under the spectrum of the school board had just announced that 13 schools in Vancouver were on the block for closures. While we're having a conversation about protecting the neighborhoods from change. The irony of that was staggering. At the same time as the retail was under threat of closing, people were saying about my grocery store in my neighborhood is about to close.
This is kind of how we're managing.
And they never connected the dots. To at the same time as they're complaining about that, they're fighting a townhouse site in their single-family neighborhood. And often, neighbors are busy. It's not their job to connect the dots. But frankly, we have to do a better job of connecting the dots. We need a more candid and blunt conversation about the whole question of change, so that conversation, as I say, is happening ubiquitously long before a development proposal is popping up, and it's the first time anybody's even thought about it. Because that is just a bloodbath.
Yes.
That is a recipe for angry people. And when they're angry, if they're already angry, it's very hard to have a conversation.
Yes.
So, absolutely. It's a reasonable point to say, I came here for this experience and I don't want it to change. You're entitled to that perspective. No citizen is entitled to saying, I've arrived, stop changing, please. I was at a public hearing just this week where two people objecting to a project made a similar statement. One said, I moved to the city 25 years ago, and I don't want it to change. And about 3 speakers later, the person said, I moved to the city 3 years ago, and I don't want it to change. Everybody.
So what's the cutoff for when we stop changing a city?
Okay, you're last. You're in, but now we're going to stop changing.
Yeah.
Cities constantly change. You go into a city with a reasonable expectation to be part of that change, but you can't protect your own individual definition of change. Because the truth is, there are real costs and consequences to the status quo, not the least of which is climate change, I often say that people who live in the suburbs, in car-dependent suburbs, never want to have the conversation about the costs, the financial costs of that. Why would they? They like being subsidized. The suburbs are subsidized heavily by the inner city in terms of tax generation. So why would they want to have a conversation about change? It's not in their interests. I wouldn't want to have that conversation if I were them too. But for City Hall, for elected leaders, you have to think about, you're burdened with the knowledge, I often say, of all of these pressures, all of these definitions of fairness. I think we do, as leaders, though, have to do a better job of communicating why. You know, I think citizens often think, they say what you said, and then something else happens, and then the thought were these three words: you didn't listen. I told you I wanted it to be the same, and you didn't listen. I do think city halls need, as part of this ubiquitous conversation, do need to do a better job of explaining why decisions are made. And I use these words like burdened with the knowledge. Your city council listens to the public every day in their community, every day. But your city council is also burdened with the knowledge of its own priorities that it has stated to mitigate climate change, etc., constantly hears from experts and staff and other citizens, and you are burdened with all of these perspectives. So when you don't do what one individual who has been here 25 years and doesn't want it to change, when you don't do what they demand of you, there's probably a reason, but we often don't do a good job of explaining that. I think we need more conversations.
You can't take that long to answer every question, or we're not going to get through all these questions. But very good points, and I think, to recap, change is happening anyway, so we can play a role in, crafting that change. So that's what I took away from it. Okay, I'm going to
save a lot of time if I just
yes.
said that, right?
Do you want me to? I'll just, compress your answers. Okay, so lots of audience questions. So this is going to be a little bit of speed. We've got time, but sure. You get what I'm trying to say here. Yep. Okay, why isn't a car-free Mississauga being talked about? Shouldn't anything be on the table when you're taking an innovation, future-forward approach?
Well, if you're talking about a 50-year plan, yes. Although I doubt cars will be gone even then. But I'm an idealistic pragmatist, or a pragmatic idealist. We aren't going to stop suburbs, so we have to make suburbs better. We aren't going to ban the car. I don't see any indication. And frankly, the more we talk about banning the car, all it does is fuel the opposition to say, look at these crazy people. They want to ban the car. Don't they know that people need their car? Not only is that wrong-headed, it's also ableist. So you're feeding the opposition to show how unreasonable you look. And you're entitled to have that opinion, but as a pragmatist in city building, I think we have to fundamentally change the relationship of cars in cities. And that is not a small thing. But banning the car, we may ban the car on specific streets, car-free streets, people streets, etc. We may even do it in a district. We can do it temporarily. But cars will be part of Mississauga for a long time. You just need to stop surrendering your city to the car entirely.
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine going completely car-free. Well, let's maybe not baby steps. We want to take steps, but that would be a big jump.
And I don't mind big jumps. I'm not talking about just only do baby steps, because we're in a 5-crisis world.
Yes,
so we need to do significant things. We need to go further and faster. But in my 32 years of doing this, as soon as you talk about car-free in a city like Mississauga, your conversation is polarized and ineffective, and you lose.
Agreed. Okay, one of the folks out here is asking, how much of Mississauga have you gone out and seen and gotten around to visit, particularly on foot? Any comments?
I haven't tried to walk around your suburbs for obvious reasons.
We had a big walk downtown, though, last time you were here.
I've walked around downtown several times, including bad weather and good weather. I had my mishap the first time I walked around. I tripped on a badly placed curb and scuffed up my hand, so it's my walkable injury.
He was looking up at the towers while he tripped.
And there was a bad curve from a curb cut for cars. But I've walked, I've taken public transit, I've driven, I've walked around the suburbs after driving to places in the suburbs. We've walked with your staff team. We've discussed as we've walked. The only thing I haven't done is bike. but I hear your bike infrastructure needs work.
Let's talk about that. We've got a question about that. Let me pull that one up. When it comes to cycling infrastructure, and I think you referenced this, should cities focus on, that minimum grid for travel across the city, or how should we look at tackling that, especially in a city the size of ours?
In the fullness of time, you need a ubiquitous bike infrastructure in order to get to high levels of mode shift. In the immediate term, the next 2-3 years, you need a minimum grid, and you need it in a fast build scenario. This isn't one street at a time done very expensively. There are cities around the world that are building hundreds of kilometers of bike infrastructure in a year. And that's what is necessary. So you do it, my immediate city, you do it in an immediate sense, and then on an opportunistic basis, you put in the permanent solution. If you want to, you might end up liking the temporary. I don't like the word temporary because it sounds unsafe. It's not unsafe. It just doesn't look expensive. And it isn't expensive. It actually can be done quite quickly, quite cheaply, but protected. Safe, protected, separated minimum grid infrastructure done fast. That is the key. You've got a bike infrastructure plan, what do you call it? The cycling master plan?
Yep.
It still has too much consideration of not real bike infrastructure, because paint ain't infrastructure, and sharrows aren't infrastructure. So you need a system, a plan for safe, protected bike infrastructure, and you need to do it in a hell of a lot faster than 27 years, because as I understand it, that was the time frame. And by the way, that was a very pragmatic way to do it. Well, gee, we're going to do it on an opportunistic basis, so we don't have to put a large amount of the capital budget to it, and that equals 27 years. Well, probably about 25 years longer than it should take to actually address the climate emergency. That's what you do when you're not in an emergency. When I hear that, I think, I'm going to buy you a dictionary and show you the definition of crisis and show you the definition of emergency. So you take that 27-year plan, improve it, and do it in 3 years. That's what you do in an emergency. So I think there is a real opportunity to do that. And what I worry about is when you are ready to have that conversation, that's going to be a hard conversation in Mississauga, because you built one bike lane and people are already probably saying, well, I don't see more people riding bikes, so bike lanes don't work. Well, they don't work when you do one bike lane. You're trying to have a conversation with the community about something they can't see right now because it doesn't exist right now. You don't have the infrastructure that would lead to a lot of cyclists, a lot of people on bikes. So you're talking about something that they can't picture. And they're looking at the one bike lane you already have built, and they keep saying, I haven't seen any bikers in there. Well, that's because it's only one bike lane. It's not a complete network. So it's going to be a hard conversation when you're ready to have this conversation. But I think it's really important that you have the right conversation about it, because it's too easy to just have that narrative be, well, we built a bike lane and nobody's using it, so I guess bike lanes are bad or a waste of money.
Yep, some good points, and I think we are working on a program to shorten that timeline on the cycling master plan. So
I say that knowing that we're working on this.
Yes.
But I'm saying to all of you, I hope you all agree that in a climate crisis, 27 years to do a cycling master plan is kind of ridiculous.
Okay, let's jump to something else. There's so many questions. I'm having a hard time even grabbing them all. So the air or space above much of our commercial space is unused. How can we use this space, especially to support the influx of people into our city? So maybe let's talk a little bit about our strip malls and things like that. Yes.
Well, the strip malls that are one story with the big parking area and the curb cut that I tripped on and scuffed my hand. And that's just in the downtown, let alone the whole city. So obviously, the good news is that the large shopping malls and the small shopping plazas, whatever you call them, the strip malls, they are the large enough land holdings to actually do urban moments in your pattern. But I don't need to tell you all that's politically contentious. It's hard because some folks are going to say that's way too much density for the suburbs. But that is absolutely what is necessary in order to create suburbs that aren't all just one thing. The challenge can often be you replace the strip mall with the housing, but sometimes the developers don't want to build retail at the base of the housing.
We actually have a big challenge with that, getting the retail that we want, or getting the retail replaced instead of just residential.
Right. So you need the housing, but you also need the retail, because you want walkable things that people can walk to. So you need both. And I think having a very clear public policy that says these commercial areas, which are walkable and serve a purpose, a good positive purpose in the neighborhoods, but are dramatically underutilized, can be places for more density, more housing, more homes, more body heat, but they should not be at the expense of the mixed use. It should be yes and. It's a necessity to achieve the mixed use too, as well.
But some of the things that you talk about, not trying to defend, but you talk about the policy around mixed use. You talked about policies around 2- and 3-bedroom homes in multi-residential, and those are things we desperately want, and we can do policies on, but they're not really very enforceable, and they certainly don't make it once things escalate to our favorite Ontario Land Tribunal. So I guess, and we've had some conversations about this, I mean, we have to find a way to get leverage and negotiate them in, I suppose, but it is very hard to implement these policies when we don't have the teeth to enforce them.
Right, and that's why I make the point. You know, I'm not some person who comes to Ontario and says, why don't you people do good planning? I started in Ontario, I know the answer to that. Part of the answer is the system won't let you, hence my slide about swimming with your feet tied together. But where that's an excuse is I do think we have to do a better job when we fight the battles. You know, when we've talked about the idea that mandating retail has been challenged to the tribunal, and the city lost.
Yes.
My response, I don't think I'm speaking about anything confidential, is, and I'm not saying, you know, well, you should have just did what I say and it would work. It sounds really arrogant. But I am convinced that frequently we make the wrong argument and then we lose. The problem with retail, I'm getting into the weeds here, but the problem with retail...
We've got lots of questions, so...
Yeah, the problem with retail mandated is you lose at the tribunal because it's seen as, it's written up in the policy as a retail policy. In other words, we don't need that retail because we've got enough retail, and they hire a big commercial retail strategist, and they are full of shit. I used to work in that area in the 90s. You pay a retail, somebody's going to sue me right now, but you pay a retail expert to say something and they will say it. That is my experience. But you lose because you make it a question of whether you need that retailing. That is not the right question. The right question is, this is transportation policy. This is so you can get cars off the road. The planned function is to get cars off the road by providing walkable things. And it is critical to your achievement of your plan to get cars off the road by providing walkable things. And that's why you're mandating retail at grade. I am somewhat convinced, and I might be naive here because I wasn't part of the board hearing, but I'm somewhat convinced that if the policy writing is positioned differently and tie it to the established goals of your plan, we can win. But planning departments often buy into making it the wrong argument, and then they lose.
Fair. We'll see how things go in 2026. Perhaps there'll be some shifting things at the board and at the province. Another question.
Good luck.
Moving on. Okay, this is an interesting one. How are you defining a sustainable city? What are you saving us from?
I'm not saving you from anything. I don't have a hero complex. What I'm helping you with, or trying to help you with, is not a definition of sustainability. I hate wasting time with a brand new definition of an old concept. My definition of sustainability is in Brundtland. Brundtland from when? 1986? Social, environmental, economic, and adding cultural. We don't need a new definition of sustainability. What we need is to implement it. What we need is to actually connect the dots better in our decision making. And that is in things like how we build our housing, how we build our mix, how we build our transportation infrastructure. That's why I had that slide that said, look at how you treat your density, your trees, and your cars. We don't have to overcomplicate this, and we don't have to waste time coming up with new buzzwords, although I like buzzwords if they can help a conversation. We don't need a replacement to sustainability, and we don't need a new definition of sustainability. We just need to implement it in real life.
Okay. What would be the most important first step for Mississauga to make our city better?
This.
Okay.
Check. I wasn't kidding when I said I can tell a lot by a city that I come into when I look at the ubiquitousness of the conversation about city building. It's not magic, it's not a magic bean, but if you're having a conversation that raises all boats, so that when you're having engagement about a plan or a project or what have you, you've got this ubiquitous conversation about why we even need to change, why density is not a bad word, why all of these things are true. There are cities that I work in where the mayor has a regular speaking series. I've spoken at many of the mayor speaker series on blank. A ubiquitous conversation. Auckland has something called Auckland Conversations. Every month they have hundreds of people in a conversation. I don't really believe the question, what should you do first? Because my line is, you do everything first. I'm not linear.
Yeah.
I can walk and chew gum and juggle and do all these things, and we have to, and sometimes this narrative is, well, you can't do that until you do this, which is a great way to paralyze yourself. So my real answer is you do everything. There is no first. But if I talked about the conditions under which you can have a better city building, I would probably start with the conversation. Because if you're not having these kinds of conversations, it's just bloodbath after bloodbath. Yeah. Every time you're talking about a new project or a new bike lane or a new plan or a new strategy.
Yeah, and I mean, that was part of bringing you here and doing this talk, is we want to bring the community along with us on this conversation so that it's not just policy and change being driven from City Hall. Okay, what else? When the dreams sold to immigrants are big houses, a car for each person, etc., how do we change the narrative so that living in towers is valued?
Well, start telling the truth. The truth is the big house is only going to be economically available to a certain strata. That is just the reality. Single detached homes, as we grow with finite land, are going to be less and less a percentage of the overall homes in your city, period. That is just geometry. But I think the narrative, is about a competitive quality of life. What my predecessor in Vancouver, Larry Beasley, always used to say was that the Living First strategy in Vancouver for downtown housing was about showing you could build downtown and compete with the suburbs, that you could actually outcompete the suburbs. Yeah. And what I say is there's an urban contract. If you want people to say, I don't need the 3-car garage and the home theater room in the basement and the big backyard, and I will trade that for the urban experience, then you've got to provide what the urban experience entails, which is being able to ride down the elevator and not just buy the fresh sushi. I often talk about on a given day, when I ask my kids and when my wife and I ask each other what we want for dinner, I might get 3 different things. I want sushi, I want pizza, I want this. And I can do a couple of calls or use the app and do a loop within a block, and everybody gets the food they want. I love that. That is why I would never live anywhere else but a really urban place. But it's not just the food. You need groceries. You need daycare. You need schools. You need the real stuff, not the frills. Yeah. And you need it all walkable with a high-quality experience. That's what I call the urban contract. You will trade the big backyard for the urban experience if you deliver on the contract. But too many downtowns, including yours, are building the housing without building the other parts of that contract. Amenities, keeping up with amenities, private sector amenities like the bloody grocery store, and public sector amenities like the park and the community center and the library branch, and the semi-public, like the daycare, all of those have to be delivered. You need an aggressive amenity strategy. And it's another example where in Ontario, you're swimming with your feet tied together.
Yes.
Because frankly, you don't have
How
access.
do we fund that?
You don't have a lot of access to the tools that other provinces have to leverage density and development to pay for those things. So for City Hall, you've got to make it a priority in your capital budgeting. The good news is you can reallocate some of that money you're spending constantly on the car. And actually, because that's where a big chunk, cars and policing, frankly, are where big chunks of municipal budgets go.
Yep.
You're in a budget conversation and a priorities conversation right now. You've got to be doing better on the amenities. If you want people to make that trade and value the urban apartment living experience, you have to deliver on the contract. You have to.
Okay. We're going to do a poll. And here we go. That's how to get onto the technology. All right, the poll is, in your opinion, what is the single most important issue facing the city of Mississauga today? Is that up there? Availability of housing, transportation options, public safety, climate, cost of living, or the famous other category? They'll show when we close the poll in 15 seconds. Okay, oh, there we go. Cost of living, ta-da. Yes, transportation options. Okay, I don't think we're bowled over by those results, are we, Brent?
You should be more worried about climate change.
Yes.
It'll affect everything else. But other than that, I'm not surprised.
Okay, so many questions. What is the best approach where there is a divergence between public opinion and best theories/practices? Why do I feel like one of our staff members in the audience asked that question? But it's fair, right?
Again,
because we've got a lot of really smart folks, professionals, who have every great intention and are bringing forward facts and theories, like a lot of things that you're bringing forward. And there are people who just flat out don't buy it.
Go ahead and applaud if you want. I have many clients who say to me some version of, Brent, tell me all the things we can do in our city to make things better, but only the things that aren't controversial. And I say, bad news. Everything that would do real positive things in your city are controversial. Everything. That's the primary reason for why you haven't done it yet. If it were popular, you would have already done it. But that's why the conversation is so important. In the cities that are doing this well, there is a constant candid conversation about the status quo. There is a blunt honesty about the costs and consequences of not changing. And the conversation is about how to change, not whether you change. So I think you need to be able to challenge popularity. Your elected leaders need to go in with the blunt honesty that every single thing that you could do to make the city really better may cost you some votes. But that's leadership. Leadership is not doing things when they're popular. Yeah, that was a cheap applause line, I know. But what I also say is it's my job, it's the job of your planning department, it's the job of your civil service to, frankly, help your politicians do the scary, unpopular thing. That's why we all need to do a better job of making the case. That's why I went around to probably 30 or 40 community presentations talking about the D word, density. We need to do a better job of making it easier for your politicians to do the right thing. It's not enough to just say, I wish my politicians would be more brave. I always used to say when I was at City Hall, if my politicians balked at the scary but completely necessary thing, then I didn't do enough to position them to be able to do the thing they knew was right. So that's why we need the different conversation. That's why my answer is you need to change the conversation. Because if not, it's like shooting ducks in a barrel. Bring up the idea, unpopular. Politician says no. Good idea, unpopular. Politician says no. Boom, boom, boom. It's predictable. So we need to change the conversation. By telling the truth. The cool thing about everything I talk about is none of it is spin. I try to not even exaggerate, because all it does is give the opposition talking points. And every single thing I learned from my 6 years planning for the city of Calgary, which is the most right-wing city in the country, that if you can't make the business case, you won't get buy-in. I often say that I planned for the most right-wing city in Canada and the most left-wing city in Canada, Calgary and Vancouver. And we were doing, in many cases, very similar things. Vancouver was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Calgary was doing it because there was a proven business case. And I got really good at making the business case. And the facts and the data and the evidence and the good storytelling, well, no, we don't have that. But the facts and the evidence and the data are all on our side. We fail because we make the data boring and we suck at storytelling. So we need to do a much better job of being persuasive. And just stop being so mind-numbingly boring. I talk about the fact that when we engage the community in a conversation about city building, we somehow take this incredibly interesting and important thing, cities, that everyone cares about because you live in it, and we somehow manage to make it incredibly boring. It's actually a remarkable skill to do that.
It's a gift.
And yet we managed to pull it off. So that needs to change.
Okay, let's jump back to transit and transportation. So the question straight out is, what is your opinion about the new LRT under construction that will connect the city of Mississauga with Brent? And I guess I'll kind of expand on that to say, what do you think we need to do to make sure that that helps us in our goals, in all the things you've talked about today?
I don't know it well enough to know if I would have any comments about the alignment.
Well, we've talked about how the downtown loop should have been critical.
Done. It's amazing how we can value engineer in order to improve the cost. We can value engineer out something that loses public value.
Yeah.
One of the often things I say we need to fundamentally change is our conversation about how much things cost. Because the number one, you propose anything, the first question is, how much will it cost? And what budget are we taking it out of? The real conversation should be, how much value does it create? What does it cost versus what does it save? Everything I talk about are value-saving ideas, not value-costing ideas. And they have demonstrated return on investments and lead to more successful cities, more tax generation. They actually save line items in a public budget, but they cost more in one line on a public budget. And we get so fixated on a line on a budget, we will forego revenue. So I often say, if you're not investing in bike infrastructure based on what every city I've seen has proven, you are literally costing your city money because you are losing the revenue that it would generate. When you're dragging out your bike lanes over 27 years to save money, you're costing money. You are literally foregoing money. But we do a terrible job of talking about what things cost versus what things save and the value that things create. And by the way, that should be a fundamentally different way of having your budget conversations whenever you're having a budget conversation.
Okay, noted. As the CPA
I feel like
on the stage.
I'm a bit tired, and I've been traveling a lot, so I feel like I'm sitting there cranky and going, you should, you know.
Good conversation. Okay, what else do we got on here? We've got a question about Vision Zero, really asking what's the city's biggest barrier to achieving Vision Zero. I mean, you're not deep into the weeds on that, but I think you can wager a guess.
Car culture, and that's tied to leadership. You know, the narrative is that'll cost me 2 minutes on my commute if I lower the speed limits, if I redesign to allow other uses, that will and make everyone safer. The coolest stat about bike lanes is it literally lowers rates of accidents and consequence of accidents for every way of getting around. You build safe bike infrastructure, less people die in vehicles or are injured in vehicles, less people die on bikes or are injured, less people die walking or are injured. It literally makes every mode of transportation safer. But again, we have this lazy conversation about Vision Zero that it's anti-car. It's not. It's about saving everyone's lives, including the people in vehicles. Or if you just don't want a fender bender and don't want to have to deal with the insurance, it literally reduces the rates of fender benders. So the things that make us safer for Vision Zero also help for everything else. But we have this incredibly reductionist conversation about the 2 minutes that theoretically it could save, but usually it doesn't even do that. Usually it doesn't even do that if you actually look at the data.
Yeah, we see some of those challenges with, complaints about speeding in the neighborhood, but then we put in the automated speed enforcement cameras, and then suddenly, can you turn up can we increase the speed limits? Do we need the cameras there? I mean, it is a tough balance when we're trying to...
The funny thing about Vision Zero is, I'd be happy if you just did Vision Reasonable. Like the idea of having 0 deaths.
Yeah.
You actually are designing to encourage speeding. It's the opposite of encouraging slow down. Your lanes are too wide. You've taken away the on-street parking that was planned in the right-of-way design by allowing curb cut after curb cut after curb cut in your suburbs. I once had a suburban councillor in Calgary ask me, my constituents are complaining about the speeding in my neighborhood. It's very dangerous. What should I tell them? I said, tell them it's because of the garages. We had allowed double-car curb cut. The street design was designed on the assumption of on-street parking. The curb cuts meant that you couldn't do any on-street parking, and also street trees, so there were no street trees, or sidewalks, so there were no consistent sidewalks, so it wasn't walkable or pleasant. But the driving speed, or the design speed, was entirely too wide, and so people were speeding, and that's why you were speeding. I loved the question. He asked me at an open council because it gave me an opportunity to have a conversation about how we were designing everything in our suburbs, starting with garages. But that's how we need to have a conversation about Vision Zero, about design speed, etc. We need a sophisticated conversation, and usually the Vision Zero, the politics are too simplistic because the conversation is too simplistic.
This is back to telling the story.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned parking, so let's talk about that. There's a couple questions on here about parking. You talked about it a bit in your talk, but that's another big issue, right? Yeah. Reducing parking minimums, on-street parking, allocating space for parking and parking structures. Give us some of your thoughts on that, and maybe some things you've already seen around Mississauga.
Parking regulations is one of the biggest failures in North American planning history. It's one of the least scientific things. We have a lot of things in planning that there's not a lot of real science around, but parking regulations more than anything else. There was never a science around parking regulations. They were originally done guessing, and then every city copied the other cities. The emperor has no clothes. But the one thing I can tell you about them is they're too high. And so we're in a conversation where we're building too much parking. It's actually inducing our car ownership, excessive car ownership and driving. So it's fueling, pun intended, the whole issue of car dependency and car encouragement. And it's mandated by the city because it's illegal to build less. So what I say to cities, whether it's getting rid of parking minimums or strategically changing them in the way we did in Kingston, what you're doing is at least making sure that they're not overbuilding parking because you forced them to. The thing to remember when you get rid of parking minimums is that doesn't mean you're getting rid of parking. You're just not mandating that the developer over-provide. What we've seen in every city that has gotten rid of minimums in recent years, I've been following all of them carefully, is they haven't stopped building parking. They just build how much they think they need to support their customers if it's retail, to get buyers or tenants if it's multifamily housing. And they're coming up. And if they want to brand and market a project as low parking, then they can do that. You know, there's a reason why a very car-friendly city like Edmonton was the first Canadian city that had suburbs included in it that got rid of parking minimums. Edmonton, for God's sakes. They're very pragmatic. This was not idealistic. This was very pragmatic. They just said the market will figure it out, and they won't underbuild because it's not in their interest, but they won't overbuild because we forced them to.
So there are examples where it's been successful.
Yes, and as I say, what I've said in some cities is you can either get rid of your parking minimums, which if you don't have a sophisticated municipality, frankly like Mississauga does, to do something more strategic, then it's very easy and a very good political soundbite to say, we just voted to get rid of our parking minimums. Nice and simple. But what we did in Kingston, I said to my clients in Kingston, you could either do that, get the really good soundbite, or we could do something sophisticated that maybe gives us a triple word score, where we get the car share at the same time. The other things that we can't mandate at the same time, and we leverage parking, just like you leverage density. And to their credit—
Use it as part of negotiating with development.
Right, if you do this, Vancouver, for example, has the most successful car share system in North America. You cannot swing a stick without hitting car share. And that is why, by far, car share in Vancouver is by far, not even close, the most successful usership of car share. And it's because for years, for decades, Vancouver never got rid of its parking minimum, but you could reduce the parking on site that you built by trading 4 parking spaces. You could do 4 less parking spaces if you did a car share plus the original car. The developer had to pay for the original car, but you could trade. It's fine for the board and the appeals because it's not a requirement. It's an incentive. But every developer took advantage of it. So not only did you get in every single private project built in Vancouver over several decades, there is car share. If it's not in my building, it's in the one next door. The one next door, I have never not been able to get car share in Vancouver when I needed it.
I did try to use car share last year because we went on a car diet at my house, and I used transit to get to and from City Hall for a year. And I tried to use car share, and there's like 1 car in all of downtown Mississauga for car share. So
and then we've
got some work to do there.
Well, I guess car share doesn't work, huh? I guess car share isn't a good idea. You know, it's like the bad bike lane, and you conclude that bike lanes don't work.
Yeah.
Well, duh, as my son would say.
Okay, so, we're starting to run out of time, so hold on. So we're going to do the last poll.
The point is, use regulation to create incentive. Don't just default to getting rid of If Vancouver had gotten rid of parking minimums, they would have got applause for how progressive they were, and there would be no car share in downtown Vancouver.
So we can be as good as Vancouver, and certainly as good as Kingston. Okay, so the last poll. What, in your opinion, would you say is missing in Mississauga as it is today? Parks and open... people are flying through the answers. Parks and open spaces, ability to meet my needs in my own neighborhood, diverse and multicultural, cleanliness. What do we got? Oh, it's moving. So ability to move around easily in many ways.
You notice it's the same question as the first question Sherry asked, but the first question was positive, and this is asking what's missing. So we're going to compare the answers.
So it's looking like moving around is winning by a landslide. So back to our conversations about all of the different ways to get around. So we're at 8:26. I'm going to maybe ask you to close out with, let's see a good question to close out with. Mississauga and Vancouver have somewhat similar populations, though the densities are obviously different. But what can we learn from each other?
A lot, because every city can learn from every city. My fine-grained answer is Vancouver, and by that I mean Metro Vancouver, is literally the hotbed of transit-oriented development. Got a friend who literally wrote a book on transit-oriented development. When she does a PowerPoint showing all the North American successful transit-oriented development, 8 out of the 10 she shows are from Metro Vancouver. And I actually pointed that out to her, and she said, yeah, I know, they would have been 10, but I put in a couple others just for some diversity. If you want to see transit-oriented, significant transit-oriented development in density and mixed use, etc., come take a trip to Metro Vancouver and ride the SkyTrain, and you will see.
Can Vancouver learn from Mississauga?
I've been using Mississauga as a slide
Not the bad thing.
Well, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. And you can learn from bad things, too. Every city can learn from every other city, including what not to do. But again,
we're so proud, aren't we?
I've never begrudged Mississauga.
We've got a lot of great
with its you were one of the first who even tried, okay? And I always give credit based on the context. You know, you were one of the first to even try to create a suburban downtown in a former suburb and make an urban place. Yeah. And there was no conversation, are you trying to create an urban place or a higher density suburb? So I give you credit. And I think it's good that we've been able to watch Mississauga and learn from that, both positively and negatively. And I don't say that facetiously. You're not a joke in my presentation. No. You're a living laboratory, basically. And I think you can be a model, not just on the long-term plan for downtown, but the reason I talked about the immediate city is you have the potential to be the model for showing how a downtown can transform itself really quickly with that immediate city kind of attitude. And you can be the model on how to do suburbs better, the better suburb, which is critically important. In both contexts, maybe this is a good way to end. People often ask me, is Mississauga a city or a suburb? I've said that, well, it's a former suburb that's urbanizing. But the true answer is you're both, and you will be both for a long time. You are a municipality that has urban pieces and suburban pieces. And that's going to be true for a while. You're going to have more urban places as you urbanize, but you're still going to have suburbs. The key is to embrace and lean in on the idea that you want to do your urban places better, starting with your downtown, and faster. And you want to do your suburbs better too. And that's going to happen through evolution of the existing pattern. The decision Council just made relative to the accelerator funding is a big part of that. But there's more to it about mix and such. So you have an opportunity to be the model, like Kingston has become, like Vancouver has been for many years, on a conversation about better city making. And there's a lot of municipalities around Canada and North America that are struggling with the same problems you are struggling with. So you have a great opportunity to not only be a better city for yourself, but the reason I always say, your impact can go beyond your municipal boundaries. You can punch above your weight. Because the world, and certainly North America, is thirsting for successful models of how to do both those contexts better. And you could be that.
And that's not to say that there aren't a lot of great things about this city, because as a resident, I can say that this is a great place to live.
Right.
So thank you, Brent. Hopefully you enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks to all of you for sticking through the last couple of hours. I think it's been great. I think this has been recorded and it'll get posted up for those who you run around and tell all about what a great evening this was. I have a quick gift to thank you, Brent, for coming to visit us tonight, and Rob Trewartha, who helped organize all this, is going to bring that out. And thanks to all of you for coming. Really appreciate it. And this is just the beginning of the conversation. Have a good night.
A tote bag. Thank you. Nice. Thank you very much.
Some Mississauga swag. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.